The scent of freshly brewed Arabic coffee lingered in the grand suite, but no one touched it. The room, lined with panoramic windows showcasing Manhattan's glittering skyline, was silent, except for the ticking of a gold-plated wall clock. Hours had passed. 3 days, to be exact. 3 days of broken conversations, cultural misfires, mistranslations, and rising tempers. The fate of a $4.8 billion investment deal now hung by a thread no one in that room could seem to grasp. At the head of the long, polished conference table sat Kareem Holden, billionaire chairman of the Holden Sovereign Trust. His expression was unreadable, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The Gulf tycoon had flown across the ocean with a vision to bring a new architectural marvel to New York, one that would redefine its skyline forever. But the Americans hadn't understood him, not truly, not his intent, not his culture, and certainly not his words. Even with 2 professional translators present, something vital had been lost. Across from him sat Nathan Cole, the CEO of the largest private investment firm in the United States, a man known for his composure. But today, his jaw clenched, his face flushed. What had started as a cordial meeting had disintegrated into subtle jabs, miscommunications, and now, near silence. The air was thick with frustration. "Sir, I believe this is no longer productive," one of Holden's advisors said stiffly in Arabic. The translator beside him paused, then offered a rough English translation that stripped the sentence of its intended respect and replaced it with finality. Holden leaned back, eyes narrowing. He hadn't raised his voice, not once. But the temperature in the room dropped several degrees as the American team shifted uncomfortably. Then, just as someone reached to close the folder in front of them, a soft voice cut through the storm. "Excuse me, sir, may I speak?" The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't commanding, and yet everyone turned. It wasn't the translator, it wasn't the legal counsel, it wasn't anyone expected. At the far end of the room, near the silver cart of untouched refreshments, stood a woman in a crisp black and white uniform, a hotel maid. Her hair was neatly tied back, her hands gently folded over a tray she'd been holding for the past 10 minutes, waiting for someone to take the offered coffee. She looked directly at Mr. Holden. "In your language, if I may clarify something." The room froze. Kareem Holden slowly sat forward. His advisors stilled. His eyes, usually guarded, betrayed a flicker of something that hadn't been seen all day. Interest. The woman, her name stitched in simple cursive across her name tag, Claire, stood calmly. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even moved. But she had spoken in flawless Gulf Arabic. Not just the dialect, the rhythm, the grace, the subtle honorifics that only someone who had lived in the culture could grasp. Kareem's translator opened his mouth, but Holden raised a quiet hand, not to her, to him. "Let her speak," he said, also in Arabic. Claire's voice remained steady. "I believe there has been a misinterpretation, sir. What you intended as a gesture of cultural respect was taken as formality." The tone shifted because both parties began assuming insult where there was only confusion. The Americans, clueless to what was being said, looked around uneasily. Nathan Cole raised an eyebrow. "What's happening?" Holden didn't answer. He listened. Claire continued, now facing him fully. "If I may, Mr. Holden, the firm's hesitation is not about the vision, but the timeline. They misunderstood your use of the word istithmar to mean deposit, rather than long-term partnership. The mistake lies with the translator. You offered collaboration. They heard control." The room held its breath. Kareem Holden stared at her for a moment that felt like eternity. Then he smiled, a slow, deep smile that didn't reach his lips. In 3 days he turned to his team. "Prepare a new statement." "She's right." One of his advisors looked stunned. "Sir, who is she?" Claire bowed slightly. "Just housekeeping, sir." The American translator shifted nervously. Holden stood up, walked around the table, and extended his hand to Claire. "Not anymore." The rest of the room was still catching up. Nathan Cole leaned toward one of his aides. "What did she say?" The aide replied, eyes wide. "She saved the deal." Outside, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that one woman had noticed, unheard, invisible for 3 days, had just shifted the future of its skyline, and no one in that room would ever forget the sound of her voice breaking the silence. The whispers began before the elevator doors even closed. "Did you see Holden shake her hand? She's just a maid." She spoke better Arabic than the translator. Claire didn't look back. She kept her eyes ahead, hands still folded in front of her. As the golden elevator descended 39 floors down to the staff wing of the Avalon Grand, her heart was pounding so hard she was sure someone could hear it. But her face remained calm, composed, just like she'd been taught. Inside her pocket, her phone buzzed with incoming notifications. She didn't check. She already knew. Someone in that room had leaked the moment. And now, the internet would do what it always did, turn the quiet into chaos. She exited on the service level. The air cooler, walls plainer, the scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the halls. Here, no one asked questions. No one looked her in the eye. She preferred it that way. But today, heads turned. Conversations hushed. Even the head supervisor gave her a nod, respectful, surprised. In the corner of the break room, Claire finally exhaled. 3 days she had watched that room. 3 days of tension rising like steam in a kettle, and no one noticing the obvious disconnect. She'd known from the first moment when the first word was mistranslated that the entire negotiation would go sideways. She hadn't planned to speak. Housekeeping staff weren't allowed to get involved, let alone interrupt billion-dollar deals. But sometimes silence cost more than speaking. Her phone buzzed again. A single message, from a number she didn't know. "You're Arabic. Where did you learn to speak like that?" No name, no signature. Just the question. She didn't reply. She didn't need to look twice to know it was from Kareem Holden himself. She placed her phone down and stared at the staff calendar on the wall. Her next shift was scheduled in 2 days. But she knew even before she finished her coffee that her world had just shifted, because something had changed in that room. Not just the deal, not just the power dynamics, but the invisible line between who gets heard and who doesn't. And she had just stepped over it. Meanwhile, on the penthouse floor, Nathan Cole wasn't pacing. He was frozen. The man who had built skyscrapers across continents now sat still, replaying what had just unfolded in front of him. One sentence, one woman, and everything had shifted. His team scrambled around him. Advisors barked into phones. Lawyers asked questions. But Nathan stayed quiet. "Find out who she is," he finally said. One of his assistants looked up. The maid. Nathan's eyes didn't blink. No, the woman who just saved $4 billion in 30 seconds. "I want her name, her background, her file, everything." "She's not on the negotiation team." The assistant hesitated. Nathan stood. "She is now." At the same moment, Kareem Holden sat alone, looking out across the East River. He had known many kinds of intelligence, financial, strategic, political, but that Maid, she had demonstrated a different kind. The kind that comes from lived experience, from growing up in two worlds, from being invisible long enough to see everything clearly. He remembered her pronunciation, not just the clarity of her words, but the pain hidden inside them, that wasn't learned in a classroom. Picked up his phone, and this time, he didn't ask where she learned to speak. He simply said, "I'd like to meet her again." And just like that, a maid who had walked in unnoticed, unheard, and unnamed, had become the most talked about woman in 2 empires. Asterisk. The knock on her apartment door came at exactly 6 a.m., not a minute before or after. Claire hadn't slept all night. She sat fully dressed, coffee gone cold on the table, heart still unsure if the last 24 hours had actually happened. She opened the door slowly. 2 people stood outside, a woman in a sharp grey suit, holding a folder, and beside her, a man with soft eyes, carrying nothing but presents. No tie, no briefcase, just a quiet, commanding calm. "Miss Monroe?" the woman asked. Claire nodded. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Kareem Holden. He'd like to speak with you, privately." Claire blinked. "Now, if you're available." She hesitated, glanced down at her simple blouse and jeans, then back at them. The man spoke, his voice gentle but unmistakably accented. "You won't need to change. He requested to meet you as you are." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of a sleek black car, driving toward a discreet, ivy-covered townhouse nestled in the Upper East Side. No one said much, and for Claire, that silence was louder than any small talk. She had replayed the scene from the hotel 1,000 times in her head, wondering if she'd crossed a line, if she'd embarrassed herself, if she'd be fired. But when she walked through the carved oak door of that townhouse and saw Mr. Holden himself standing in the sunlit foyer, waiting for her, not with security, not with lawyers, but alone, she knew this wasn't about punishment. It was about something else entirely. He offered her tea, served it himself. No assistants, no guards, just two people sitting across a low glass table in a room that smelled faintly of oudwood and fresh jasmine. "I owe you something," he began. She shook her head. "You owe me nothing, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "You saved a multi-billion-dollar deal. You spoke a truth no one else dared to, and you did it with more grace than any diplomat I've ever known." She looked down at her hands. "I was just tired of watching people misunderstand each other." "That," he said, "is exactly why I'm here." He handed her the folder. Inside, her name, her records, her resume, her languages, her school, a photo of her mother, a medical form, her college application half filled, never submitted, her life, on paper. "You were born in Kuwait," he said quietly. "Your mother worked as a nurse, your father was a translator." She nodded. "He passed when you were 12. Yes. You moved here at 16. You worked nights to finish school. Applied to Columbia twice. Never went." Claire's voice cracked. "I couldn't afford it, and my mum was sick." He leaned forward, no judgment in his eyes. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" She shook her head. "That you chose silence until the moment it mattered most. And then you spoke not to be heard, but to help." She swallowed, unsure where this was going. "Would you come work for me?" he asked, not as a maid, as a cultural strategist, a voice between worlds, a bridge. Her breath caught. "I don't have a degree," she said quietly. "You have something better," he replied. "You have lived it." She looked up. For a moment, the girl who had spent her life cleaning rooms no one remembered saw something she'd never expected in the eyes of a billionaire. Respect. He slid another envelope across the table. Inside was a full scholarship letter, Columbia University, executive mentorship, a role with his trust's cultural initiatives department, immediate hire. Paid. Claire stared at the letter, hands trembling. "Why me?" Halden smiled gently. "Because in a room full of power, you were the only one strong enough to speak softly, and the only one who truly understood what was being said." Outside, the city roared, as always, but in that quiet townhouse, something far more powerful stirred. A maid had been seen not for her silence, but for the voice she'd held back until the world needed to hear it, and for the first time in years, Claire believed her story was only just beginning. The moment she stepped onto the Columbia campus, Claire felt like she was walking through a dream someone else had written. Students rushed by with laptops and coffee cups, laughter echoing across the courtyard, conversations in Spanish, Korean, Farsi. She felt invisible again, but in a different way, not because she was being ignored, but because no one knew her past here. No one looked at her and saw Maid. They saw someone who belonged, yet in her heart, Claire wasn't sure if she believed that. The day after her meeting with Mr. Halden, everything had changed. A driver now picked her up each morning. Her old uniform had been carefully folded and left in the back of her closet. And her apartment, once a place of stress and survival, now felt like a quiet sanctuary, still small, still modest, but now, with books stacked everywhere, papers full of notes, a new purpose in the air. She hadn't told anyone at the hotel why she was leaving. She'd just handed in her name badge, smiled at her supervisor, and walked out without looking back. But inside, the fear still sat heavy. What if they realized she didn't belong here? What if she failed? What if she was just a temporary headline, a heartwarming post someone would forget in a week? Claire tucked those thoughts deep down and focused on what Mr. Halden had said. "You've already succeeded in the hardest room of all. Every room after this will feel smaller." And, strangely, he was right. Her first class was titled Global Negotiation and Cultural Intelligence. The professor, a former ambassador, paused halfway through his lecture when Claire raised her hand and gently corrected a mistranslation he gave as an example. There was silence. Then the professor blinked. "Where did you study Arabic?" Claire hesitated. "In life, sir." The class laughed softly, but the professor didn't. He just smiled. "I'd like to speak with you after class." By the end of the week, Claire had been invited to 3 student panels, 2 international conferences, and was asked to co-author a case study with the university's Cultural Engagement Board. She wasn't just fitting in, she was changing the way others thought, and yet, her world still held another side. At night, she often walked alone, earbuds in, listening to old recordings of her father's voice, his soft instruction in Arabic, his patient way of explaining. Nuance, tone, honor. She still had her mother's old watch, still used the same phone, still kept the tray from the Avalon Grand that she'd held when she first spoke in that room, polished, untouched, symbolic. It reminded her of who she was, but what Claire didn't know was that her story was already traveling faster than she imagined. One afternoon, after a guest lecture, a young man from Sudan approached her with tears in his eyes. "My sister cleans rooms in Dubai," he said. "She doesn't speak English, but I showed her your story, and now she wants to learn." Another message came in the next day from a girl in rural Egypt who had started an Arabic-English translation page because of her. And then an email from the UN Cultural Exchange Division. "We'd like to feature you in our annual Human Voices initiative." Claire sat alone in the university cafe, reading the email 3 times, unsure how to even reply. Not long ago, she had been sweeping crumbs off the floor while CEOs debated billions over croissants. Now, she was being asked to speak for those who never got invited into the room. Still, there was something unfinished. She hadn't seen Mr. Holden again since that quiet meeting in his townhouse, until one evening, as the sun slipped behind the buildings, her phone buzzed. "I have another room that needs your voice. Tomorrow, noon. Bring your questions." No signature, but she already knew who it was, and she also knew this next room would be even more powerful than the first. The car pulled up outside a building that didn't match the scale or drama of Manhattan's high-rises. It was quiet, almost unassuming, tucked between 2 towering glass structures, like it didn't want to be noticed. But when Claire stepped through its doors, everything changed. It wasn't an office, it was a sanctuary. The walls were lined with maps, languages, and historical texts from over 40 nations. The air buzzed with low conversations in multiple tongues. Men in flowing robes and women in tailored suits walked side by side, discussing global development, education reform, and diplomacy without borders. No gold nameplates, no marble lobbies, just quiet power in motion. This wasn't a boardroom. This was the Halden Global Initiative, and somewhere inside, a conversation waited that would change everything again. A young woman with a headset met her at the entrance, greeted her in Arabic, and led her through a narrow corridor lined with quotes carved into the stone walls. One of them stopped Claire in her tracks. "When we listen only to those who hold the mic, we miss the ones holding the truth." Before she could ask who wrote it, the door at the end of the corridor opened. Kareem Holden stood beside a round table, not a long one like in the hotel, not elevated or polished to reflect power, just round, equal, simple. He motioned for her to sit on the table. No papers, no contracts, just tea, and one single envelope. She sat slowly. "I didn't bring questions," she said. "I didn't want answers," he replied. "I wanted presence." She looked around. The room held no hierarchy, just people, diverse, focused, listening. "You asked me to be a bridge," Claire said quietly, "but I'm not sure where it starts or where it ends." Holden leaned forward. "That's the gift. The best bridges never belong to one land. They simply make it possible for 2 to meet." He pushed the envelope toward her. She opened it. Inside, a travel itinerary, 10 countries, 6 months, 4 forums, 3 translation summits, 1 seat on the Global Advisory Panel for Cultural Communication Strategies. She blinked. "This isn't a job," he said. "It's a voice, one that belongs to more than you now." Claire felt her chest tighten. "What if I get it wrong?" "You will," he said calmly. "And then you'll get it right. That's what bridges do. They hold, even when they shake." She looked down at the itinerary again. The first location, Amman, Jordan, then Senegal, then Dubai. This panel, they want me to represent something I'm still learning to believe about myself. Holden smiled. "That's the best kind of representative, one who carries questions, not just answers." As she walked out of the building that afternoon, the city felt different. Not louder, not smaller, just clearer. Because for the first time, Claire understood something deeply. Her voice hadn't saved a billion-dollar deal. It had reminded a room full of power. That understanding didn't come from the loudest, richest, or most educated, but from those who had lived between languages, between worlds, between the lines no one bothered to translate. And she was ready, because the next room wouldn't be quiet, it would be the world. ChatGPT said. The stage lights were warm on her face, but Claire didn't flinch. Behind her, A screen displayed the title of the summit, Global Bridges: Voices That Change the World. In front of her, hundreds of delegates from every continent sat in silence. Heads of state, education ministers, cultural leaders, and translators from over 30 nations had come to listen not just to numbers, projections, or strategies, but to stories. And somehow, her story had brought her here. She adjusted the microphone slightly, heart steady but full. Not from nerves, but from everything that came before this moment. Every silent hallway, every unseen hour, every time she had walked into a room and been mistaken for someone invisible. That version of her, she carried with honor now. "I was never supposed to speak in that room," she began. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. "I was just housekeeping. Background, no name in the file, no seat at the table. But something was breaking in that room, something more than a business deal. It was understanding, it was trust. And I realized silence, in that moment, would have been a louder mistake than any words I might say." She paused, her voice not shaking, just deliberate. "I didn't speak to be heard. I spoke because no one else could hear what wasn't being said." A young interpreter in the front row wiped her eyes. "Languages are more than words," Claire continued. "They carry memory, they carry emotion, they carry pain, and sometimes healing, but only when we let them live in the space between us." She looked out at the faces, so many different faces, some leaning forward, others lost in thought. "For so long, I believed I had to choose between where I came from and where I was going, between the part of me that served tea and the part that dreamed in two languages. But now I understand. My voice is not an apology for my past, it's a reflection of it. Every unseen moment gave it depth. Every forgotten shift made it stronger." She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. Some of the most powerful voices in our world are still sweeping the floors, while leaders argue across tables. Some of the wisest negotiators are still carrying trays in hotel rooms, while translators struggle to bridge centuries of misunderstanding. And some of the boldest peacekeepers are just waiting to be asked, "Do you understand?" A deep silence followed, but not the kind that holds discomfort, the kind that holds respect, and then applause. First a ripple, then a wave. As she stepped down from the stage, a man in a dark suit approached her, smiling. He was from a country she'd never been to, speaking a dialect she barely understood, but she caught enough. He said, "My daughter wants to be a translator." She thought no one would ever listen to her. Claire replied softly, "They will. One day, the world won't know how to speak without her." Later that night, she stood at the edge of the summit balcony. The wind cooled against her skin, the stars dimmed by the city's glow, but still visible. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Halden. "The skyline changed, just not in the way we expected." She smiled. He was right. It wasn't just buildings that rose when people listened. It was voices, it was stories, it was hope. And somewhere, in another hotel room, maybe a young woman in uniform was holding a tray, unsure if her voice mattered. Claire closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "One day, you'll speak, and the whole room will listen."